first women's museum was founded in Bonn, Germany in 1981. It was a response to concerns raised by feminist movements about the representational gaps in mainstream museums, which created a dearth of knowledge about the historical, social, political, cultural, and aesthetic contributions of women in Germany and around the world. There are now 96 women's and gender museums across the globe, working to animate the blank pages of history by showcasing and storying this other side. Some museums operate solely in the virtual world. Others are traveling or pop-up exhibitions, while others have physical buildings or space. There is no single definition, as each women's or gender museum has its own content, context, and historical development. But there are important common articulations of their purpose and value.
Frauenmuseen haben viele Ziele, ein breites Spektrum. Sie zeigen uns eine neue Sicht, sie zeigen einen Blick auf Unbekanntes, was in konventionellen Museen seltener thematisiert werden. Denn fast alle Frauenmuseen weltweit wurden von einer privaten Initiative gegründet, weil in den konventionellen Kunst- und Geschichtsmuseen Frauen selten thematisiert werden und auch in den Sammlungen wenig mitgedacht werden. Die Geschichte und die Kunst wird meist als eine männliche Angelegenheit dargestellt, in der Frauen ihren typisch weiblichen Beitrag haben.
Seit 2006 haben wir mit unserem Museum Frauenkultur regional international einen Ort, an dem unsere Sammlung von Objekten aus dem Alltagsleben von Frauen und auch Werke von kunstschaffenden Frauen aus aller Welt präsentiert, neu entdeckt, neu interpretiert werden können. Alltagsobjekte aus dem Arbeitsalltag von Frauen aller Kontinente, häufig aus bäuerlichen Lebenswelten und von indigenen Frauengruppen, aufgezeichnete Erinnerungen unserer umfangreichen Arbeit der Oral History und Dokumente und Objekte aus Frauenbewegungen für Frieden und Gerechtigkeit in aller Welt.
정의한다면 저는 인류의 절반인 여성들의 삶과 경험을 전면에 보이도록 전시하는 공간이라고 말하고 싶습니다. 여성 박물관은 여성이 누군가에 의해 대변되는 것이 아니라 여성이 스스로 존엄한 주체임을 말하도록 하는 재현의 공간입니다.
Nosotros partimos primero de la consideración de los museos como una vía de expansión de la comunicación colectiva, ¿no? Que tiene como misión el informar y el educar, y desde ahí poder proponerse como un agente de cambio social. Entonces, continuando con esta idea, para nosotras los museos de las mujeres, siempre dentro del contexto, ¿no? Y de la realidad en que cada museo opera, porque no todos los contextos son iguales, pero consideramos que debería de estar dirigido hacia reflejar la realidad cultural que está asignada por las desigualdades de género.
Mendojmë se muzeu do të jetë një ndihmë shumë e mirë që shumë periudha historike të rëndësishme apo personazhe të grave apo histori grash të cilat janë të rëndësishme që të dihen dhe të futen në sistemin arsimor.
To usher in a new spirit of possibility, women's and gender museums focus on a range of historical, social, and cultural issues that silence, marginalize, and prejudice women.
We try to move away from the narratives of exceptional individuals and to produce, construct, and promote narratives that highlight the collective actions of women.
For me, a women's museum is a form of feminist organisation, and within that, they collect, produce, and disseminate knowledge about women's cultural lives. I identify women's museums as very much grassroots social justice museums. They specifically address the omission and the historical omission of women's art and histories from mainstream institutions.
History matters because what we learn about the past has an impact on our present structures of thought, meaning, and identity, as well as our future actions. A central role of women's and gender museums is to program historical consciousness with contemporary intent. This includes changing how we understand the contributions women have made to society over the centuries.
오랫동안 역사의 수면 밑에 잠겨있던 여성의 목소리를 현재로 불러내어 전시함으로써 여성의 역사 속 역할을 알리는 것입니다. 그리고 주요한 공백으로 남아있는 인류 역사의 퍼즐을 완성하는 것이지요.
Vielmehr geht es darum, die Forderung der Frauen in die Öffentlichkeit zu bringen und Wege aufzuzeigen, wie eine Verbesserung umzusetzen ist.
Although no woman's or gender museum is called a feminist museum, feminist theories are at the heart of their vision and mission, and they draw their creative energy to promote social and gender transformation from the passions and struggles of feminist movements worldwide.
To me, women's museums are a form of feminist organisation. And I don't think that they're identified as that in the literature that exists about them. Most of the literature looks at them specifically within the area of cultural activism, feminist curatorial studies and feminist art history, but they are very much feminist organizations.
Ich denke, dass jetzt einfach Kunst, Kunstgeschichte, Geschichte, Bildung seitdem markiert werden in allen Museen, mehr oder weniger. Und da gibt es auch noch viel zu tun, aber sie werden eben durch neue feministische Arbeit sowohl in traditionellen Museen weiterentwickelt, als eben auch in unseren Museen. Und da ist es wichtig, dass immer mehr auch so ein gemeinsamer Horizont geteilt wird.
One of the challenges the women of the world face is what we call epistemic injustice, the silencing or marginalization of women as holders, speakers, and givers of knowledge. A central mission of women's and gender museums is therefore education as a practice of epistemic justice, a practice of repositioning women as knowers. Educational work includes descriptions of the problems that exist for women, analysis of why they exist, as well as envisioning what else should or could exist and educating to bring that into existence. This pedagogical work of these museums draws on women's subjugated knowledges, restores lost knowledges, and creates new knowledges for empowerment and emancipation.
Kurz gefasst, Frauenmuseen sind für die Bildung von Mädchen und Frauen wichtig, zum Empowerment und zur Stärkung des Selbstbewusstseins.
De la nueva museología, nosotras nos definimos como una comunidad de aprendizaje.
Materiale të cilat mund të futen në kurrikulat shkollore, të cilat I kanë njohur mësuesit, po ashtu dhe mësuesit e historisë, dhe që mund të vijnë në përdorim dhe në njohje të publikut të gjerë.
So the social and cultural aim of women's museums would be the promotion of feminist perspectives of cultural heritage, and in our case, in our initiative to establish a women's museum in Egypt, the idea developed under the larger umbrella of the Cairo-based Women and Memory Forum, and which is a feminist collective, and its aim is to promote, to disseminate, to produce an alternative feminist knowledge. And feminist knowledge is powerful in different levels. I think on an individual level, that is closely connected to how women construct their own feminist consciousness, and I think this knowledge is very, like, at least in my case and in so many cases of women that I've worked with, it's very powerful.
For women's and gender museums, researching, designing, and curating exhibitions is perhaps their most central pedagogical practice. To make an exhibition is to create a structure through which we can look at the world and through the world to the other side of the limiting and constricting traditions that have been in place for centuries in order to develop alternative ways of seeing and models of being in the world.
We worked with a theatre company called Smashing Times, taking the material from the past. And for us, it was using stories, music, and then using the venues to sort of be reflective of the walkthroughs. Being able to sort of make it so that it doesn't feel like history, that there's an element of entertainment, but there's always an educational dimension.
There's a specific collection called the Lesbian Archive, which has a huge amount of information specifically about Black British lesbians. And so one of the artists was specifically tapping into that collection and taking archive items to produce a new piece of work.
In addition to exhibitions, women's and gender museums employ a variety of other pedagogical strategies, methods, and projects to forge connections with diverse audiences, stimulate dialogue and critical questioning, teach histories and new ways of perceiving, encourage creativity, provide new resources, and pay homage to women who are victims of violence and oppression, yet equally importantly, who challenge and overcome these acts of subjugation.
Tenemos también acciones colectivas, convocatorias, mejor dicho, colectivas, que tienen dos perspectivas. Por un lado, tiene una perspectiva artística, como pueden ser, por ejemplo, los proyectos de los costureros o de los libros de artistas, y otras que tienen más una reivindicación de derechos violentados, ¿no? Sobre todo lo que tiene que ver con violencia contra las mujeres, y en ese caso tenemos el proyecto de las mariposas. Representa en un objeto el nombre de cada una de las mujeres que han sido asesinadas a manos de hombres en Argentina. Entonces, el primer año se hicieron mariposas, el segundo año hicimos máscaras.
The other projects that I love that came out of the decade of centenaries was a series of fashion students who took the stories and the clothing of various women and made this contemporary clothing out of it.
Mendojmë se muzeu do të jetë një ndihmë shumë e mirë që shumë periudha historike të rëndësishme apo personazhe të grave apo histori grash të cilat janë të rëndësishme që të dihen dhe të futen në sistemin arsimor.
Conducted creative writing workshops with women, and we ended up publishing a book of women's fiction and short stories and poetry. There are also adult literacy classes and one-to-ones. And those classes utilise the collections. So women are learning how to read and write and develop those skills that they've experienced barriers to in the past through women's history itself, through the collections.
Other feminist strategies of women's and gender museums, which assist them in their pedagogical, institutional, and social change roles, are research and community collaborations, as well as training activities, sometimes adult literacy activities.
Y otra de las acciones así también más, bueno, el proyecto museístico teatral, ¿no? Esta unión que tratamos de hacer entre el museo y el teatro, y que nos derivó, por ejemplo, a la creación de uno de esos proyectos. Surgió la creación de los festivales nacionales de teatro sobre violencia de género.
So we have facilitators who train women volunteers to become women's history detectives and to go out and do the research themselves and find out about characters that interest them, and went on to start delivering training for mainstream museums on how to do grassroots feminist museum work.
When women's museums began, their central focus was on women. And although the concept of women is unstable and riddled with intersectionalities of class, race, location, ability, women remains an important political category of analysis, education, and representation. Both women's and gender institutions continue to grapple with the social constructions of the feminine, issues of womanhood, and the particular forms of silencing, violence, and degradation that women have faced as women over the centuries. But the work of these institutions has also become more complex as they tackle important contemporary continuums in feminist thinking and practice around gender and sexuality to become even more inclusive and representative.
둘째, 젠더 박물관은 LGBT를 포함하여 역사 기록에서 배제된 다양한 소수자들에도 관심을 가지며 주요 전시 콘텐츠에 포함합니다.
I think gender museums that we see in northern European countries approach gender as a much more with a wider understanding of gender, as shifting away from a binary understanding and much more about understandings of gender multiplicity and gender plurality, you know, that there are different kinds of women within a spectrum of the concept of women.
Through their imaginative educational visions and actions, women's and gender museums celebrate and honor women's resistances and resiliences and the complexities of gender to reshape what the world needs to know in order to inspire and to motivate change. These remarkable and courageous museums wield the powers of history, creativity, and the arts. They educate, collaborate, and facilitate to help all of us to see and to know the world differently. As critical pedagogical sites, women's and gender museums are changing the imagination of change.
Sie präsentieren alle Bereiche des menschlichen Lebens. Sie sind ein Sprachrohr für Frauen.
We absolutely need women's museums.